So first, I just want to start by saying that my name's Darlene McLennan. If you don't know me, I'm the Manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse in Education and Training and also a National Disability Coordination Officer based in Tasmania. Today the session is captioned and also Auslan interpreted. If to access the closed captions, you can access those at the bottom of your screen. And Jane will now put in the OneCap link if you want to actually access the captions through a website. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Lutchwita, Tasmania, Aboriginal land, and acknowledge with deep respect the traditional custodians of this land, the Palawa people. In spirit of reconciliation, ADSET respectfully acknowledges the Lutchwita nations and also recognises the Aboriginal history and culture of the land, and I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. I wish to acknowledge and pay respects to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspective, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving a way for a strong future. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all working today, and also pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating in this session today. Okay, this session is a new idea for us at ADSET. We're very excited that in partnership with the NDCO program, we wanted to bring about an opportunity to have some big picture discussions with the sector. Sometimes there's some ideas or new thoughts that kind of go across the sector that we don't actually take the time to actually discuss or debate or hear from others' points of view. So this is an opportunity to have those kind of what we're calling critical conversations. As I said at the beginning, this is an online meeting, so we encourage you to mute while you're not talking. The session is being recorded, so you can have your video on or off. We will be asking throughout the session if people want to ask a question, they can either put it into the chat or they can put their hand up and we will go over to you and hopefully your video or your sound will work. We'll play that by ear. But we really do encourage conversations. We really want this to be a really robust kind of conversation, and it's a bit scary, but I'm willing to see how we go. And I think, you know, one of the silver linings of COVID is that I think the technology such as Zoom, you know, more and more people are more confident in engaging in that way and having conversations. So over to the topic today. Recently a paper was published, 3 decades of misconception defining people with disability in Australia higher education policy. This paper argues that in the context of higher education, people with disability are subject to both cultural and economic injustice, which causes tension in how students are supported, both by high-level policy and institutional practice. We're really fortunate today to have 2 of the authors of this paper with us, and I'd like to introduce those 2 members. We have the Associate Professor Tim Pittman from the National Centre of Student Equity in Higher Education, and Dr. Matt Brett, Director of Academic Governance and Standards at Deakin University. Now, we did set a link to the paper, but we know people are time poor, so I'm just going to ask Tim to describe briefly, in 1 minute or less, provide a little bit of an overview of the paper.
Thanks, Darlene. And first, a couple of acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge I'm coming from Perth, Western Australia, which is my Whadjuk land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge Katie Ellis, Professor Katie Ellis, who is the 3 of us together wrote the paper. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but this was a team effort. It's just fallen to me to try and describe in 1 minute, which I can't, but I can offer a couple of insights into the paper and hopefully they can spark that critical conversation that we're looking at. And really what I want to focus on is the nature of classifying and counting disability in higher education. We've come a long way since the early 90s, and in particular with the advent of the Disability Discrimination Act in 1992. You look back at the higher education sector there, the bar was very low. And so it's quite easy on the one hand to point to all the gains and improvements that have occurred in the sector over a 30-year period. But we're at a stage now where our understandings of disability and disability support are much more mature, much more critical and much more nuanced than they were 30 years ago. And in the paper, one thing we explore is what we call the recognition distribution paradox. And that is that these are the two sides of the coin that are essential to supporting students with disability. On the one hand, you have the classic policy approach of redistribution. And this acknowledges that for particular types of segments of a society, and in this case, persons with disability, there are social, economic and structural barriers that set up blocks to allow stopping them from succeeding. And there's a need to actually intervene. There's a need to actually put into place policies, processes and support mechanisms to assist these students, these persons with disability. This is at its heart a deficit discourse, as we know. And deficit discourses are problematic because they position, in this case, disability as a negative, as a lacking, as a deficit. But from a policy perspective, they're important because to not do this is to deny the lived experience of many persons with disabilities, and that is that society creates barriers for them and society disables them. On the other side of the coin is what we call the recognition aspect. And this is that understanding and recognising the diversity of the experience of persons with disability and the individual identities that are created and constructed. And this is much more a positive discourse. What Matt and Katie and I argue in the paper is the entire way of collecting and reporting data in the system is still primarily around the notion of redistribution and the notion of deficit. And we've actually now got very mature and robust reporting mechanisms, but we're questioning whether that data is actually being used for anything meaningful to support students with disability. In the paper, we point to several instances where institutions report data differently that create big inaccuracies, massive inaccuracies in how students with disability are represented in their university. We also point in the paper to the disability support officers who have an intimate and strong advocacy understanding of how students need to be supported. But the way in which data is collected and the way in which this information is communicated up the channel and ultimately to the federal government level means that meaningful action is perhaps not taken as well as it should. So this is what we mean by the redistribution recognition dilemma. On the one hand, we have to acknowledge the deficits around disability. We have to acknowledge the role society places in creating barriers. And it is important, and it is very useful to collect and code and define disability. But on the other hand, we've got all this data and it's aggregating, it's creating this very aggregate, undefined understanding of what disability is. And we think it's inhibiting further change. That's more than a minute, that's what I'd like to say. But what I would like to do is quickly pass on to Matt if he wants to add any other his thoughts he thinks that I haven't covered.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Darlene, and thanks everyone for joining us today. When one puts together a paper for an academic journal, one is lucky to get 1 or 2 or 3 people reading it, but we've got kind of 98 people in the room today already that are choosing to embark on a kind of conversation based on the work that we've been doing. So thanks everyone. And looking at the list of participants, there's many long-standing DLOs that have made a huge and positive impact on the experience of students with disabilities. So I just want to say thank you for your work and thanks for coming along today. In terms of the paper itself, I think Tim's done a fantastic job of summing that up, and I don't want to sort of elaborate too much, but I do think it's worthwhile maybe drawing attention to some of the conclusions in the paper which talk about taking a different approach, taking bringing a new frame to the way in which we might be thinking about what data we collect, what do we do with it, and what use and utility it has. And I think through the course of today's conversation, I would hope that we would be able to tap into your rich insights, given your experience of disability in the sector, to help us kind of think about what can we do differently, and what might be more useful to have a better experience for students with disabilities in higher education.
Great, thanks, Matt. So before we kind of unpack those kind of bigger questions, we just wanted to run a poll. So Jane, if you want to put the poll up. We're just kind of wanting to understand how people think, what people think about the effectiveness of the Disability Discrimination Act and the disability standards in education in protecting people. So the question is, how effective is the DDA and the DSE legislation in protecting people with disabilities from less favourable treatment in higher education? There are 3 answers. One is effective, one is ineffective, and the other is it's complicated. So I think, it's not our relationship status, it's what we feel about the legislation. All right. I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer that. Okay, Jane, are you right to end the poll? And so we have 12% people said it's effective, 4% said it's ineffective, and 84% people said it's complicated. Probably should have added that little bit at the end. But yeah, so Matt and Tim, does that surprise you, those answers?
I'll go first briefly, and no, it doesn't surprise me. I think one thing, we're seeing a lot of things, but certainly one thing we're seeing is universities, when it comes to disability support, they're like running at different speeds and running at different gears. Underpinning this work was a 12-month fellowship I did, and we surveyed over 1,700 students with disability, which was a fantastic response. And a critical thing that we found was, if you imagine the disability support officers of the DLOs as your locus, as your centre locus, and it's like dropping a pebble in a lake and the ripples spread outwards. The connections and the contacts with those people on the whole, overall, are really positive and really affirmative. But as the ripples spread outwards throughout the university, the power becomes dissipated and the message becomes muted. And the problem for students is that 90% of their time is spent outside the disability support office with teachers, with staff, with other academics. And that's why it's complicated. You can have these pockets of absolute brilliance and support, and we can see from the survey responses that you can have a student going from University A to University B and being really happy because the level of support has increased, and the reverse happens as well. And individual interactions with individual persons at the university can sometimes make or break a student's learning experience.
Anything you want to add to that, Matt?
Yeah, so it doesn't surprise me that we've got a high proportion of people saying it's complicated. Disability officers work in the space of making reasonable adjustments or identifying reasonable adjustments, and they're always context dependent and dependent on the individual, and it's complicated. So I wouldn't expect anything different given today's audience, but I do think it's worthwhile turning attention to the positive and the negative response, which was kind of running 3-to-1, I think, if my maths is correct, or 4-to-1 in terms of DDA working as opposed to sort of not working. And we see even today, can you imagine 30 years ago having a gathering of disability focused individuals with not just one, but 2 sign language interpreters and kind of live captioning, and transcript available afterwards, et cetera, et cetera. So things have improved a lot. We've normalised disability support in all sorts of positive ways. But on the margins, that 4%, we've still got a lot of work to do. And I think there are some systemic flaws and problems in our legal frameworks and in our higher education frameworks that we need to build on the successes that we can easily point to do even better in future.
Brilliant, thank you. I just wanted to encourage people, because as I said at the beginning of this, we are really wanting to have a conversation and encourage people to share their thoughts or to put some questions into the chat as we go along. So just in the paper, Matt and Tim, you identified that people with disability are often, or still subject often, to both economic and cultural disadvantage in the Australian higher education policy, and describe this as recognition distribution dilemma, where this population must both deny and claim their subjectivity, which, you know, Tim, you actually highlighted a little bit in your intro. How do we make a distinction between the economic and cultural disadvantage, and what is the impact of this distribution dilemma for people with disability?
I'd like to answer that. I'd actually like to answer by addressing a question in the chat that Amelia just put in. She's saying, I'm interested to know what you've learned about student experience of disclosure of disability, because identity is fundamental to disclosure. The two are intertwined. Both in the act of identifying and disclosing having a disability, but also who you choose to disclose to, the way in which you disclose, how a person identifies themselves. I actually should have led with this. In terms of identification of myself, I identify as an ally, a disability ally. And so wherever possible, I'm trying to use the student voice to say, these are the experiences that people have shared with me. And in doing so, I acknowledge that these are individual experiences being shared and do not necessarily represent in any way an aggregate or a uniform or a majority position. But in general terms, the recognition side of it is overall, universities are seen as safe spaces by the majority of students with disability. We actually identify community student support across 6 various domains. And the first domain is attitudes. In other words, what is the attitudes, the general attitude within the institution to persons with disability? And that's where universities across all 6 domains rate the highest. Overall, they rate very, very highly. But there are 2 important codicils to that. The first is that for a lot of students, they point out that their disability or their situation is invisible. That gives them agency on whether or not to disclose. That gives them a lot of power in whether they choose to disclose or not. And the more that power is taken away from them, the more, for example, their disability is visible or identified by other people, the less there is a tendency in the data to see they're less happy with the attitudes towards them. So that's a very important part of it. And the second part that I alluded to in my earlier answer was, for some students, just one experience can be devastating. And again, students have recounted through the survey data and through the interviews that we conducted one-on-one afterwards of an overall very strong institutional support, very clearly defined processes, very well-organised access plans. But then the interactions of one person at the coalface, it can have devastating experiences for that student. So it's ongoing fraud. For some students that I talk to, they feel they're living on a knife edge. They feel that the very next interaction can be the one that will devastate them.
That's huge, isn't it? Matt, did you want to add something as well?
I think picking up on the crux of that sort of recognition redistribution dilemma, this will be something that's familiar to many people here today, and that comes down to, what do you call the service? There's a lot of pressure out there to move away from the notion of the disability liaison officer or the disability support service, because there are many people for whom that's not a fundamental part of their identity. Their chronic mental health or mental or health issues, sometimes it's a bit of a conceptual jump for them to sort of say, I will access that particular service. So there's, on the one hand, recognising sort of disability as an issue. On the other hand, how do you sort of accommodate and recognise? There are some that are kind of reticent to engage with that idea. There's no easy answers to this, and I'm sure lots of people in the room have experienced kind of those challenges and those tensions, and those debates around whether or not to maintain the language of disability or to move to something else. And if you do move, how do you recognise? How do you give due prominence to a concept or an idea that many people see as fundamental to who they are? It's very, very tricky.
It's probably one of the next critical conversations I would like to hold, because yes, certainly as a sector, there are many of the disabilities teams around the country in TAFEs and in higher education sector have changed their names, and I think it's one of those critical conversations we need to have. We also have people with disability. Many people with disability are identity is very strong, and then we're also now understanding ableism a lot more within within the world generally, but also in academia. So look, when we're kind of looking at data, so that was something that we're wanting to discuss today, but also in the paper. What data do you think could have an impact on advancing the social understandings of disability? And I suppose then is it reasonable to ask students that question around their disability?
I'll let Matt go first once.
Fundamentally, in my view, we do need a more sophisticated view of disability as a starting point before we actually start jumping into what data would we collect and how do we approach it. When the Enrolment Declaration for Disability was first sort of agreed to in the early 90s, in a recent book chapter, Lynn Martin, who ran the project of getting those indicators in place, sort of reveals that there was a lot of debate around the table with vice chancellors and government officials around whether or not there should be an indicator for disability or not. And in the end, they passed it only narrowly with a vote of that committee. So if there might have been one or two votes differently, we might be having a very different conversation today. That definition, that indicator, was agreed as a temporary one-year trial and stayed unchanged until I think 2019 or 2020, and it's only recently just been changed. And I think in terms of the data that we've been drawing upon and utilising, fundamentally it's the result of a compromise struck 30 years ago with a very imperfect understanding of what disability means. And I think in terms of moving forward, and without getting too bogged down into what would be more useful, etc., I think it's worthwhile just kind of calling out that what we've had, what we've been using, has been deeply flawed, and we do need a better way. And I'd be really interested in any thoughts that the audience and participants in today's conversation have as to what would be a better, more robust, conceptually sound and pragmatically useful definition of disability in its data collection.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I think Matt's covered it really well, and I'm really interested in the chat. I'd much rather get to that. I just noticed that Helen Thomas posted, and I totally agree with her that I think that the higher education sector has a lot to learn from schools in terms of using voice and agency. I think that's spot on. And this is kind of a question that Jackie's posted that I actually want to open and see what people think, because Jackie said that 75% of the students accessing the service at her university have mental health conditions, so there's strong grounds to change our name away from disability. What I experienced when I was speaking to the students, again, it was 1,700 students, so I'm going to qualify that. It was only a couple of instances, but nonetheless, it was a couple of instances. The students, when we got into one-to-one communication, said, Tim, why are you calling mental health a disability? And my response to that was, it's officially recognised in the 10 categories. And these students said, we don't see that as a disability. So again, it gets back to that recognition that within these sub-communities and identities are very important in terms of identifying as who you are and identifying for the purposes of support and recognition. There is some resistance to calling mental health a disability. I don't know, I'm really curious to see from the DSOs or from others what their experiences of that are, what their thoughts of that are.
Well, this is going to take us down another little path, I think. So if people want to keep the conversation going in the chat, that'd be absolutely brilliant. One of the questions was, what do you see as the role of state governments in the higher education policy in this space and in facilitating change? But so, you've got your state, but also federal policy drivers around that change. So any thoughts on government and their role to play in this?
I have thoughts, and I don't know that they'll be shared by Matt or anyone else. The reality is that states have vacated the space in higher education, and they've vacated the space for over a quarter of a century. As soon as the federal government controlled the purse strings and took over the purse strings, the state governments have effectively vacated the space. So what do I see as the role of state governments? Zero. The reality is, and this also gets to another critical part of the DDA, is the fundamental structure of the DDA means that the buck stops with the institution. So when it comes to supporting students with disability, the onus rests on the institution. So you now have three players. You have the university, who is ultimately responsible for making sure that discrimination does not occur. You have the federal government, who is still the major heavy lifter for funding universities and has a responsibility to ensure that they are adequately resourced to support students with disability. And you have states as a silent partner. And I think in that environment, the key relationship is actually between the universities and the federal government, and in getting those support structures correct. Matt, what do you think?
Agree with some caveats, and sorry to get it all kind of hoity-toity and kind of theoretical here, but there's a view about sort of universities in the modern state that they've got what's called positional centrality, and that sort of relates to the fact that universities today kind of interact with every feature of the modern sort of nation state, whether it be banking, health, education, finance, et cetera, et cetera. So universities are kind of right there, sort of at the crossroads of everything. And yes, the Commonwealth has the financial purse strings and has the policy responsibility to nudge the university in a particular direction. But universities, by virtue of that centrality, interact with state governments, interact with state education systems, health systems, etc. So I think there is a role there for the state, particularly when it comes to the relationship between school education and progress through the universities to play a role, to be thinking critically around how its responsibilities for educating it's young people, is supporting them for an effective transition into universities and engaging with universities in the right way. I really like the sort of question posed by Matilda Webb in the chat, and I wonder whether Matilda would be comfortable in sort of getting off mute and on screen to sort of elaborate on that sort of question. But I think that question around the kind of social structures and the challenges of working with those social structures, I think if you take that idea of the centrality of universities kind of seriously, those social structures are incredibly complicated, and not just about the university, but how the university deals with broader society. And I think that's worthy of sort of unpacking a little bit in terms of how fair is it to put the responsibility on individual people with disabilities to solve all those structural barriers. I think it's a shared responsibility between the individual, the state, the Commonwealth, the institutions, staff such as ourselves, and broader staff to play a role in dismantling those barriers. And I suppose part of the question today is what data, what approach would be helpful or useful in supporting that process. Kind of noting that what we've got has been kind of okay. It's improved things a lot, but it still leaves a lot of challenges. It still results in a lot of discrimination, which is frankly unlawful and needs to change.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So you raised about that data, and for the sector, there's been some changes recently for the higher education sector in regards to the disability support program that does fund a certain amount of adjustments or a percentage of adjustments for people with disability in higher education, but also HEMS data category has recently changed. I'm just wondering, Yeah, does it align with your recommendations or your paper or that you wrote around those changes to that data?
So from my point of view, my view has changed. I've been in research of higher education policy now for 15 years. I've focused on social inclusion, diversity and access for all the 15 years. But I've really moved actively into the space of disability research in the last 3 or 4 years, and that has changed my view. My view from a researcher point of view, a sociological researcher, is I love data. I love data, and we collect robust data in heaps. But the more I move into this space, the more I hear from persons with disabilities and allies of persons with disabilities. I think this is really fraught. And this is what we try to identify in this paper. There's a lot of really good data that have been collected, but it's not being used. Okay, I should qualify that because at one stage I was scrolling through and I see a couple of names of people here who I know have done some excellent work with the data and have made some really interesting insights, but I would say that they are exceptions to the rule. And so when you're talking about 75,000 students at some level disclosing something about themselves, and that data, you know, like the Indiana Jones original movie, the Ark just gets locked up in a warehouse and never be seen again. It does fill me with concern, and I think that there are some moral implications to that concern me. So if we're going to collect the data, we need to use it better, and we need to be able to show directly back to the relative disability communities that we are using this data responsibly and to their benefit.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think that change in indicator is a step in the right direction. So it's a positive, but it's just a single step in what I would consider to be a much longer and more important journey. I think it's kind of worth noting along those lines that the indicator that was superseded included information around disability categories, and it wasn't until some research that Darlene was involved in through UTAS, I think around about 2016, 2017, and some work that I had done in publishing some work around sort of disability, that was the first time that there was formal publication or analysis of those kind of subcategories of disability. So for 25 years, the data had just been sitting there, and might have been used here and there for institutional purposes, but it was pretty much ignored by everyone. It's a hugely problematic. Part of that is not a function of the data, but a function of the way in which staff and institutions have engaged with that data. So the change in indicator, I think, coincides with maybe greater sophistication in the sector around how to use it. And I saw some analysis that was undertaken by Merryn McCracken just last week, who has pulled out the mental health subcomponents of that indicator, which is fascinating, fantastic data, and I'd be really keen to hear from Merryn directly as to what motivated that, what might have changed to get a little bit more ingrained in the data, and what she thinks might be useful in terms of the change in the indicator and where it might be heading in future. In the spirit of a conversation, if Merryn is able to speak to that. Sorry to put you on the spot, Merryn.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Have you got a camera, Merryn, at all? Or
I've got it turned on.
Okay,
yeah, I can see.
Jane.
I can see.
Merryn. Might get Jane
Okay.
to even pin you.
Yep. I've long been interested in what we can do with having a look at both the data we collect in our services, that broader data, but also some of the big institutional surveys. And there's been, and I think that for us as providers, the mental health area has posed probably the biggest challenge of the last 5 to 10 years. And while I'm always a bit hesitant about collecting information around disability categories or types, I think particularly in that mental health area, it was really interesting to me. So we've always at Deakin done a bit of analysis of some of those big surveys on just pulling out the disability side of things. So the graduate destinations, what's happening with students with disability and how do they sit with students without disability? What happens with students in the student satisfaction surveys and where are the differences? And we see things like differences around engagement, differences around certainly graduate outcomes. And this year I went to our wonderful planning unit and said, can we pull that information out now around mental health specifically and make a comparison with that compared to all students with disability and students without? And it was the first time that I'd actually seen what we probably suspected, is that there's actually quite a gap between students with mental health and their experiences and success and so on, compared to all students with disability or to other students with disability and to all students. So it just, like, it's just the data, but it was really, we're working, I've been on a group with Matt that's looking at our mental health strategy for the university, and it just was really, I guess, affirming that this is very important work that we're doing, but also opens up so many other questions and avenues that we might want to investigate. So yeah, it was really interesting to do, and I'm keen to hear if others are doing that sort of work. And I think what interests me is how we might do that sort of sector-wide too.
Brilliant. Did you want to respond at all, Matt, or any further? Or
maybe just kind of recognising, again, kind of respecting the audience that we've got here today, that the enrolment declaration is just that. It's a declaration at enrolment or re-enrolment, where students are sort of talking about their experiences at that point in time. And we all know that circumstances can change from the very minute that they complete that form. Life can happen, things can change, their identity, their understanding of themselves, the interaction between their own unique attributes and the new and novel environment that they're coming into can change. And other things happen, the biological processes and other things, onset of mental illness, accidents, et cetera, et cetera. So this notion of disability being a kind of fixed attribute of a data statistic, I think really needs to be challenged to something that's a little bit more dynamic and reflecting the sort of barriers and the experiences of education that people have. And I think if the change in the indicator is a step in the right direction, I think the future steps might need to be thinking more critically around understanding the experiences of students over the course of their studies, not just once a year re-enrolment declaration processes.
Mm. So we have that once a year process. I mean, is it, should institutions be also kind of collecting data, or, or I suppose in other, I suppose Merryn gave us a fantastic example of, how the data can be used. And I think for many years, I think data has just gone in and nothing's come out, or we actually haven't taken the opportunity to explore it. Is there any other ways you think that we could use the data better, or we should be utilising the data, or has anybody got any ideas that they want to add to the chat box? And I'm having struggle catching up with all the questions that are coming in. So if anybody grabs the question, I want
to pick up on something that Judith Hudson said. This is a different way of looking at data. She's recounting the story. Judith, they are recounting the story of presenting a lot of information to a student who's trying to access some support. And Judith then explains how the student could then take that information from university. That's another way of looking at data. That when we say collect data, there should be ideally a direct benefit to the person that you are interacting with, the person with disability. And if you can't do that, then at the very least an indirect benefit by saying we will further our knowledge and we will broaden our understanding in this area so we can improve institutional policies. So I think that's, and in this sense, we're kind of like circling back. We also tend to forget that the word disability is a relative newcomer to policy. You can go back to the records as far back as, I'm sure it's earlier, but I've gone back to 1920s, and you can see reasonable adjustments being made in universities. And the language in the professorial minutes and the languages in the Senate papers and the language in the teaching and academic papers, they don't use the word disability. They say blind student, deaf student, etc. They identify specific issues and how they have dealt with them. And the word disability, insofar as it appears, is a much more generic term. Society is disabling us, or this policy disables us, or whatever. And I feel that we're almost like coming a full circle, where reasonable adjustments and attitudes, positive attitudes towards persons with disabilities, actually go back over 100 years. But we have to be also realistic and say 100 years ago, universities were incredibly exclusive places, incredibly elite, prestigious places. And so we're talking about the number of students you can probably count on one hand. And in that sense, the word disability had no meaningful use. It just said, this is the language of the time. There's a student here who is blind, and I'm going to arrange some braille for them. We then fast forward to the 1990s, and we start to want to use this term disability to draw awareness to a lot of issues that people are confronting, and to understand and broaden our support. And what I guess I'm saying, and this returns back to something earlier, we've now reached the stage where I'm wondering if that term has outlived its usefulness. I haven't arrived to a strong conclusion there, but I wonder if the term disability is itself disabling. I haven't come to a conclusion there yet, but I do think that we need to stop focusing so much on that word and start focusing more on the individual experiences and requirements that students need in order to succeed.
Yeah, I agree. So, Nat, earlier you spoke around the Fair Chance for All, and we actually put a link into the chat so people can access that. I think the most recent writings that you did around Fair Chance for All. I mean, do you feel from the original work that was done and many moons ago, do you feel like there's been positive changes for students? Yeah,
I think I'm old enough for my memory to sort of stretch back to the kind of mid to early 90s and kind of universities, etc. So I can say absolutely things have changed enormously and changed for the better. But it's, things have evolved and things have grown a little bit more complicated in some ways. So these identity recognition sort of issues that we're talking about with naming kind of services and thinking about disability are in some respects a function of the success of expanding access and thinking more broadly around the challenges that can be experienced by individuals whose health, body structures and functions. I'm not trying to get all medical model on you all, but the attributes of individuals kind of we've had a growing understanding of what that means and the kinds of things that are necessary to support effective learning. Things have got better, but it's now I suppose upon you, upon us collectively, and on the sector to continue that involvement to make sure that everyone, no matter who they are, who wants to engage in higher education, is able to succeed and has the right supports in place. And not to diminish any of the quality chat that's coming through thick and fast and all the comments, etc. But I'm still sort of going back to Matilda's sort of comment around the students having to fit in with a system that's kind of designed in some ways that to not accommodate their needs. And I think there are some really big challenges there to make sure that the key structures in higher education, curriculum, assessment, policy, social, technological, etc., are as inclusive as they can be. And everyone here would agree that's a really, really difficult challenge to get that right. But we need to strive to do better to make sure that everyone can succeed in higher education. And one statistic that our flawed measures remind us of, and that's that there is persistently low lower rates of success for students with disabilities compared to people who are not disclosing disability, and that's been the case for 30 years. We need to bridge that gap and we need to do better.
Thank you. Now, there's been fabulous chat, which has kind of overwhelmed me a little bit because I'm worried I'm missing questions. I just want to encourage, we've put Marion on the spot there by turning her camera on and getting her to talk. Is anybody else willing to ask a question on camera or even by audio, just to kind of have that kind of conversation going as well as the chat? Just put your hand up. I don't know if I will see it, but hopefully the crew in the background. While we're waiting, I just wanted to thank Alicia Ford, David Swain and Jane Hawkswood for being in the background for us. And yes, so Savannah.
Yep. Sorry, I was just going to say, yeah.
Excellent. So thanks, Savannah. You can unmute yourself if you'd like to talk.
Darlene, it's Julie Rogan here from Griffiths.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Julie. Yep.
I just, it's a bit of a comment really, but interested in other people's experiences. I've found often students going on placement, the disclosure experience is often very negative. Mostly, I think, with the expectations of the university more than perhaps the employer they're going to on what needs to be disclosed, and giving some students with a disability a negative idea of what it will be like in the workplace if they disclose.
Any speakers want to make any comment to that?
Yeah, I think going back to what I was saying before around positional centrality, universities don't operate in isolation as little sort of isolated sort of communities. They do intersect with the broader world, but we don't control that broader world. So I think we need to fix things in higher ed, but also higher ed can play a role in helping to fix the broader economy and the broader labour market. And again, that's complicated, particularly when you're talking about professions and accreditation requirements and all the other kind of assumptions that are embedded in those things. But yeah, it's not just one thing. Yeah, we need to fix ourselves in higher ed. We also need to try and work with the broader economy to help fix them, as they need to take care of their own sort of responsibilities as well under DDA, etc. But it's again, it's complicated and very, very challenging.
Excellent. Savannah, we've got you spotlighted now for the next question, and I think then we'll go to Melinda Allen as well after that.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I was just wanted to weigh in because there was some talk in the chat about disclosure and kind of how we often talk about it as this like one-off thing of now that they've disclosed and now we know. But I think from what we've talked about, it's evident that it's more of an ongoing disclosure and how from time to time, situation to situation, things can evolve. And I think that kind of links in with that talk about data and how we use that, because, okay, someone might disclose something at one point, but then, yeah, how do we use that information and how to deal with that ever-changing nature of it? And that's a similar thing I've come across in my work. So for context, I work with Jackie at Curtin, but I also do research on disclosure in more of a mental health area. So it's definitely something I can see in both kind of ways. And I also mentioned how, yes, there's a disclosure from the person themselves, but then talking about agency and things and how important that is. And when we come across situations where someone might forward disclose that information or like share that information on with others without necessarily the consent from that individual, or in a different situation on behalf of that person. And something, at least from my research, yes, in a different context, but talking about that forward disclosure, something that participants have kind of expressed is that concern of, you know, I wasn't really involved in that discussion, so I didn't have any control of how that would play out and how those other people would then use that information going forward. So yeah, I could go on and on about disclosure. So.
Well, I think we have another topic for a webinar coming up, so we'll be in touch. That's great. Any comments, Matt or Tim?
No, I think that's really interesting what Silvana said, and I was watching the chat around disclosure. We actually finish off our article with a quote from a person who identifies having disability, Elizabeth Chandler, and I always remember it sticks in my head is the two things that they said is first, the process of identification hurts. And if you read their article, then they're saying it's you know, is this a good pain, a pain towards a positive outcome, or a bad pain? And the other quote that they make that always resonates with is my current attitude towards identification with disability is, and I think it's been in the chat, and I think that's what Silvana was also saying, is it changes. At one point in time, the person may wish to disclose, at another person they may not. At one point in time, they may identify primarily from their viewpoint of having a disability, at another point not. And our systems are modernistic and a bit monolithic, and they're not set up to deal with that. And they're not going to be until we can embed disability awareness throughout the whole higher education community.
Yeah. Thank you, Silvana, for sharing that. Matt, just a quick one, because I've got Melinda also wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, just jumping quickly there, an advance notice, another paper that myself and Tim have got coming out soon, or another report, or myself, Tim and Darlene coming out soon on the finances of disability in Australian higher education. And I think one of the issues with the data that highlights growth in participation of students with disabilities by the flawed metric gives policymakers a flawed sense that, yeah, whatever we're doing is working fine, so we don't actually need to do anything else. Had we a stronger case to be able to invest an appropriate amount in the support of students with disabilities, we might be able to manage cohort tracking and monitoring and case managing students a little bit more effectively. You wouldn't have DLOs with case numbers in kind of 400 or 500s or whatever the numbers are today. We'd be able to kind of work more collaboratively on these disclosure issues and employment, etc. But we can't do some of that because we don't have the money. And part of the reason we don't have the money is because it hasn't been prioritised, and it hasn't been prioritised because people think it's okay. There's not a problem there. We've got the wrong data telling us the wrong signals, and it's creating problems down the track.
Good point. So Melinda, you've got your hand up. So.
Thank you. It might take me a little while to figure out how to put it back down again. Thank you. My name's Melinda Allen. I am a Program Director with TAFE New South Wales. But Merrin, I'm also a student of Deakin University. Last year, I think it was the first time I ever was in a position of needing to disclose that I had a disability, and I was able to access adjustments in my education with Deakin. Quite an unusual experience, and just being sort of understanding what is the process going to entail, what should I expect, what does it mean for me, some of that, the issues that Shauna touched on, which is around how much should I trust in sharing, and without being able to see or hear some of those experiences around what to expect, it's very difficult, I think, for the organisation to demonstrate their trustworthiness as well. I've absolutely felt supported. Some of the automation that's been able to be brought in there, where my adjustments come out automatically, and so therefore I don't need to continue to advocate for myself, but I know that if I need adjustments to my adjustments, I can go back and have those conversations. That one of the big ones for me, I have done a stint with Department of Education in New South Wales around the primary and secondary school students. We had a strong focus around the outcomes, both lifelong for students with disability. I am getting the sense that there is a gap for students in that transition period. It's like schools have this care to the gate, and then beyond the gate, well, there's the big unknown, and that transition support for students with disability into higher education, and the advocacy voice probably switches for many students at that point. They need to advocate for themselves, and understanding how we might be able to support that transition and build those connections. Did you have any experiences or observations in that transition planning space?
Thanks, Melinda.
I might jump in first, Tim, if that's okay. So first off, again, it's worth highlighting that there are differences in what happens in schools and what happens in universities, and even from a data collection perspective, the national consistent data collection for disabilities, and I've just garbled the name of that, but
National collection, consistent collection of data
is much more sophisticated than what we've got in higher ed. So already you're sort of going from one system that's trying to get a nuanced appreciation to a system that has a very kind of flawed indicator. From a resourcing perspective, we've got Darlene as an NDCO spanning the whole of Tasmania. So, just to sort of highlight the sort of resourcing challenges, how can we have an NDCO whose reason for being is to support transition of students from school to higher ed and employment, sort of serving every student in Tasmania by herself. It's not. We need a radical increase in the resourcing for disability in higher ed to do it properly, but we just haven't had the data or the political interest or the policy interest in doing it better. And I think if there's a take-home message for today, it's find ways of using the data to make that claim, to make the claim for more resourcing to do it properly, because students are incredibly disadvantaged and pay lifelong price for inadequate service, inadequate education. Again, the caveats that things have improved, but there's still a hell of a whole long way to go.
Melinda, the NDCO program is doing a number of different projects in that area, so we might connect with you offline and have a further conversation with you, because I think you'd be a great asset for us to talk to. Tim, was there anything you wanted to make comment to there as well?
Oh, I'd love to, but I'm also conscious of the time.
Yep, time.
And and I'd rather give the voice to other people in these closing moments.
Well, I think we really revved up at the end. We'll just have to work out how we rev up quickly in the first 10 minutes, because I think it was great having everybody engage as they did it at the end there. The conversation in the chat has been absolutely wonderful, and there's really key themes already emerging for, I think, future critical conversations. We're going to send out a survey for everybody who has attended today, and one of the questions on that survey is what are our next critical conversations that we could have. But we shall also look through the chat and pull some of those things out as well. So with probably 1 minute to go, I just might hand to Tim and Matt for just one quick last comment each.
Thank you. This has been a great initiative. I've really enjoyed the chat. Thank you to Paul and Teal. Just thank you everyone for contributing.
And Matt?
Yeah, ditto. I'll just say to everyone, just keep up the good fight. Keep pursuing the right thing. And any point in time you'd like to hear more of my garbled words, feel free to tap me on the shoulder, and I'm happy to be rolled out at any time.
That's brilliant. The conversation in the chat was great. We are investigating, looking at trying to find some online forum, that we can have kind of themes and chats in the future as well. We're looking for an accessible forum, because I think today just showed, some of the thinking that people are wanting to nut out with each other, and it's been great to do that. I'm sorry if I've missed some of the chat or some of the questions. It went fast and furious there for a little while. But if any questions have gone unanswered, we'll endeavour to actually get back to you with those answers or post it on the website. This recording will be placed on the ADSET website. People who have registered will receive a link once that's gone up, so you can re-watch the recording or share it with your friends. And really do encourage you to engage in our survey so that we can, find out what the next topic will be. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to our captioner and our Auslan interpreters, and thank you to our wonderful presenters, Matt and Tim, and to the back end people that supported this. Have a great day everybody. Take care.